Tonight what I want to do is I want to just look at the gray shaded boxes that are at, in John's case, the top of his page are the gray shaded boxes. And I want to look at those individually and just run through all of them tonight. And so that's a big help. All right. Scott upstairs, are you picking me up yet?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't have you on the main box. Everything's going. I just can't get YouTube. Yes, you're on. You're on. You're on. Sorry about that.
I don't know that the speakers here are on. At any rate, we're going to move along. I didn't do what I thought. Oh, there we did. I went to some transition stuff. I thought that'd be real cute. Now I got to figure out how it works.
The more you overtake the plumbing, the easier it is to step up a drain.
Yeah. So we're continuing this lesson 1. And Old Testament book sequence chart is what you're looking at. And so basically what we'll say is that all of Bible history, Old Testament, Intertestament, and New Testament, the whole thing is in 13 Bible time periods. And if you can break it up into small parts like that, then you can get the historical flow that is marching through. So Old Testament plus New Testament, 13 Bible periods. 10 of them are in the Old Testament, and then you have one intertestamental period that we handled in Sunday school here a month or so ago. And then 2 New Testament time periods. Now, just for quiz, what do you think are the 2 New Testament time periods?
Gospels.
The Gospels, so you have the life of Christ. It'd be the life of Christ. And then what would be the second time period of the New Testament?
History.
Okay, the church, the spread of the church. The growth and spread of the church to the ends of the earth. And so that would be the 2 Bible periods in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we have 10. And so we want to look at those. So you've got your chart like that. And that chart is just basically telling you the relationship between those 10 time periods and the books. Because if you'll notice on your chart, you have the gray boxes at the top, or I don't know how you're oriented, but if those are at the top, then there are division lines that pull you down. So the first 2 time periods are going to be, probably would help if I pointed to the screen up here. So these first 2 time periods, creation to Abraham and Abraham to Exodus, are going to be in the book of Genesis. So I've got 2 time periods just in the book of Genesis. And then you'll have Exodus and wanderings that are going to take the book of Exodus and Numbers, also Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Why are Leviticus and Deuteronomy here instead of up here? Did I just not have enough room? What's the deal? How come Leviticus and Deuteronomy? In fact, Job is over there. And why are these books down here? Okay, they don't move you anywhere geographically or historically. They happen during the time period that is the yellow streak that runs through here. And so the books that don't move us anywhere geographically and historically, we put down below, and that's, so in other words, Leviticus is given when they're at Mount Sinai. Well, we're not moving. We're just getting the book of Leviticus right there, but the book of Exodus, we get quite a few things that are happening there that give you a historical flow, and we understand that. So that's kind of the way that functions. So if you would, just kind of turn your chart so that we're going to be looking at just the gray boxes tonight. Did we pray? I don't think we did. All right, Pastor Sam, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, bless our time together and give us clear minds and open hearts to receive what you have for us and be able to put these parts together so that we can understand the big picture, Father, of our hope and how we put this together in our own lives and share it. We pray in Jesus' name.
You could say that the entire Bible is an unfolding drama. And we're just going to look at the little parts, where how this story unfolds. It's a drama about God's redemption. So William Graham Scroggie wrote a 3-volume set entitled The Unfolding Drama of Redemption. And I bought that. I think that set's worth its weight in gold. As far as value of books go, William Graham Scroggie. And I think he got real sick one time. And while he was sick, he wrote some very important works, and that's one of them that he wrote, the 3-volume set, The Unfolding Drama of Redemption. Anyway, we are going to look at this. The first one, then, your first box that you have, that first gray box, is creation to Abraham. And that is going to, I'm going to put in Usher's date here. That was Bishop Usher. He was Anglican, Church of Ireland. And he was a professor at Trinity College in Dublin, very much a Calvinist, by the way. And he lived in the 1600s. But he came up with, one of his hobbies was to study biblical chronology, and he came up with a date that a lot of people have used, and that was for creation, 4004 BC. I added it was Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. I guess January 1st, I don't know. But at any rate, oh, that's right, it started in the evening.
So it's been about 6 or so.
Been about 6 o'clock, January 1st, yeah, that's right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. Stick around. So the dates on this, the parameters for this time period are 4004 BC, or whenever creation happened, to 2165 or 2166, depending on which date you wrote down. That's when Abraham is born. So this is creation to Abraham. Now there's a lot of things that happen in that, and it's a period of time of 1,839 years, and I thought you'd want to know that. And that's not in your notes, so you want to just jot that down on your chart. It's 1,839 years. And you remember there were 4 things that happened before Abraham. We get 11 chapters that cover this time period. And they are creation, fall, flood, and Babel. What are they?
Creation, fall, flood, and Babel.
Okay. Those are the 4 things, first 11 chapters of Genesis. Okay, and we don't even get the full 11 chapters. It's really 10 and a half chapters before we get into Abraham's genealogy. And what we want to think about is and the outside end of that would be also the first 12 chapters of the book of Exodus, including Passover. Because this has taken us up to, no, I'm sorry. This is just creation to Abraham. This is the first one. I'm reading ahead in my notes. All right, so the second time period is Abraham to the Exodus. And so starting in chapter 12 of Genesis, you're moving along. You're in the second time period. This is a period of 719 years. And it's taken us from the birth of Abraham, 2165, to the time of the Exodus, which is 1446 BC. They're exiting from where?
Egypt.
Egypt. So in 719 years, a lot of stuff is happening, right? I mean, we're starting out with just one guy, Abraham, and his wife Sarah. And by the time we're exiting Egypt in 1446, we've got 2 million of his descendants. So there's a lot of stuff happens in 719 years. Of course, in Genesis, starting in 12, you're focusing mainly on 4 generations. Abraham and his son Isaac, and his son
Jacob.
and Jacob's how many sons?
12.
12. And we're especially focused on son number 11, which is Joseph, who is sold into slavery. All right. When we think about that, Joseph was sold into slavery at age 17. At about age 30, he becomes the prime minister. Joseph was born, I don't have this in your notes, but he was born in 1915. And that's the year my house was built in Aurora. Oh, that's right. There's BC and AD. Okay, it's different. All right, so we're separated by 4,000 years. But, so 1915 is Joseph is born, and he died in 1805. So he lived to be 110. And Moses, I just want you to see, it's one thing to just have a list of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses, but you need to know there's a time gap between Joseph and Moses. Because in Joseph's generation, we don't have very many people. You know, there were 70 in all that came down into Egypt, and that's the time frame for Joseph. But by the time that Moses is born, we're a nation of 2 million, roughly. That's an estimate. And so Moses was born in 1526 BC. You don't have that either. But he was born in 1526. And so between the death of Joseph and the birth of Moses is 279 years. 279 years. It's 80 years later, when Moses is 80, that he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt. So, and that would be in 1446. So altogether, Israel was in Egypt. Does anybody know how many years Israel was in Egypt? 400 and, if you do the math, 2160. I didn't give that. Which one do you have the Exodus? That's not very clear, is it?
Huh?
It's not real clear. But, anyway, Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. And they were down there, 1876. The way I remember 1876 is my grandfather was born in 1875. And I just add a year. So the way you can remember that is you have to remember when my grandfather was born. And then you can remember to add 1 year. And then it's 1876. And what is that date? Well, that's when Jacob and Joseph's brothers all moved down into Egypt. 1876 BC. they move into Egypt. And so from 1876 BC until the Exodus, Exodus of 1446, is 430 years. All right, well, that's just extra.
How long was they actually in slavery? Was it like 300 years?
We don't know how many years they were actually in slavery. I don't know. Do you know how many years? Anybody know?
Until a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph.
Right. So you've got just the 279 years from the time he dies until things are so bad that God raises up or Moses is born. And so you've got those 279 years between there. And how many of the 279 years were they actually in slavery? Well, it says there arose a king who did not know Joseph. I'm going to guess 2, 3, 4 generations or the kings went by, maybe before you actually had oppression of them. But there's no data for us to figure that out.
And then one of the reasons why they became slaves was because they were multiplying so fast.
Yes.
And they were afraid that they would take over. Actually.
Right.
It was growing in number.
All right, the next one is Exodus and Wanderings. And this time period is 1446 to 1406, a period of 40 years. And this is the third Bible period. And Israel during this 40 years is under the leadership of whom?
Moses. Oh, Moses.
Pharaoh.
Moses.
Moses.
Okay.
Under Moses for this 40 years. So they will exit in 1446 and till 1406 when the wilderness wanderings come to an end. Moses will die in 1406. And who will take over? Joshua. So let's just think, this particular time period has a lot of geographical movements. It has 6 geographical movements, major geographic movements. And let me just tell you what they were. Well, where did we start out? When we're starting out in the book of Exodus, what country are they in?
Egypt.
Egypt. Okay, so we're starting out in Egypt. So that'd be place number 1, right? And then we go to the Red Sea, and we're going to cross the Red Sea. So I'm going to call Red Sea as location number 2. So then we cross that, and we go to Mount Sinai. So I'm going to call that location 3, Mount Sinai. And while they're at Mount Sinai, they're going to get the law, and they're going to enter into a covenant relationship with God. You're at Exodus chapter 20 by this time. And then they are also going to build what? What are they going to build?
Tower of Babel.
No.
No.
The tabernacle, the center of worship. They're going to build that. It's a portable place of worship. Does anybody know? This is trivia. Does anybody know you had an outer court of fine twisted linen, 7.5 feet tall, by the way. And does anybody know how big of a place that was? That outer court that housed it, does anybody know how big that was? 150 foot by 75 foot and 7.5 foot tall. Okay, but the building structure in the center, does anybody remember that? Well, remember that the Holy of Holies was a perfect cube. So it was 15 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet. That's the Holy of Holies. That whole structure was 45 feet long. At the back, 15 feet was the Holy of Holies. Okay. So they built that while they were at Mount Sinai, and that will be their center of worship. And God gave Moses great detail. And so the second half of the book of Exodus is completely given over to the building of the tabernacle. And so then during that time, while they're at Mount Sinai, they get the book of Leviticus. And so that's on your chart. And you see that, where that is. You see Exodus, and then you'll see Leviticus there. And then also, when we think about the wanderings, they don't stay. When they get that all built, it's time to move out. And so they move from there. And so the next location, I don't remember how far we are in our counting, but the next location is a place of decision, a place of a tragic decision. Does anybody know what that would be, that place? Kadesh Barnea. Everybody say Kadesh Barnea. Yes, you did. All right, and at Kadesh Barnea, they camped there, and they sent 12 spies into Canaan to spy it out. But if you'll look at the list of places they went all the way up into Syria, almost to Damascus. They really had quite a trip that they made, and they did it in 40 days. Kind of interesting. So they came back and they said, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, and we need to right now make plans to move in and take the place over. Is that what they said?
Two of them did.
Yeah, two of them.
did. What were their names? Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb. But the other 10 said what?
Giants, they're too big for us, we can't do this.
You can't do it, impossible. And so that was it. What's a big lesson that you can learn from that story? Say it real loud. The majority is not always right. Yeah, that's one lesson you can learn.
If God says to do it, He will make it happen, even if it looks humanly impossible.
Yeah. In fact, I would suggest that in your lifetime you're going to discover that God will call you to do things you cannot do without Him. So anyway, they said no, and the result of that was bad news. So that was the Exodus and the wanderings. Let's see, that took us to, actually then at that, after they leave Kadesh Barnea, they wander in the wilderness area, and that would be the book of Numbers. When you leave Sinai, the book of Numbers picks up, and so all the wilderness wanderings are going to take you through that 38 years of wandering. And then they will wind up, their last place they camp is on the Transjordan side. That would be the eastern side of the Jordan. In fact, the eastern side of the Dead Sea, right at the top, almost at the top, as far as north and south go, about the top of the Dead Sea, on the east side of the Jordan River, and that's the plains of Moab, and that's where they're camped. It's at that location that Moses speaks to the second generation and gives the book of Deuteronomy. All right. Okay. Including, by the way, the Palestinian covenant. That would be the terms that God gave to them in Deuteronomy 28 to 30, mostly in chapter 28. And that is the key to understanding the rest of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 28 is the key to understanding all of the prophets that you'll read later on. Okay. Then, after that, we have the conquest. Moses dies up on Mount Nebo. And then you have the conquest of Canaan. They cross the Jordan River under the leadership of Joshua. And this time period, the conquest, is 56 years and takes you from 1406 to 1350. But the actual conquest was about 7 years' time. There were a series of campaigns. There was a central campaign that Joshua led them initially, and then they had a southern campaign, and then they had a northern campaign. So it was a conquer and divide strategy. They cut the land in half, and then they went after the south and went after the north. God was the one that led them to do that. There was a problem with the conquest. It was an incomplete conquest. They did not drive out all the people or slaughter people in a couple of cases that they were supposed to have killed. They didn't do it, and they didn't drive them out. They let them live, a lot of them. They let live among them. And God said, don't do that. Why not? Why did God want them driven out and for them not to share their territory with the Canaanites? Why?
They didn't want to mix in? They didn't want to mix in and
He
take
didn't.
it on the paganism?
We didn't want them mixing because they would adopt the customs and they would adopt the morals, they would adopt the religion of the Canaanite people, and so God had said, you drive them completely out. They didn't do it. And so because you had an incomplete conquest, you had what followed was a crisis. Conquest was followed by crisis. And that was the period of the Judges, where there were 7 cycles of sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation. They would sin, and then God would allow their enemies to overpower them, and they would go into servitude, and things would be rough on them. They would be oppressed. They would cry out to God. That's the supplication. They would cry out to God, and He would raise up a deliverer called a judge, and that judge would lead them to victory, and we're just calling that salvation. We're not talking about eternal salvation. We're talking about being saved from the oppression of enemies. The period of the judges is 299 years. There were 13 judges, including Samuel, who was the last of the judges and the first of the prophets.
So, in that context, Jesus Christ would be the last judge.
Okay, yes. Well, at least in another context, he
Well,
will.
in terms of the salvation, you know, we go through the same cycle of
Yes.
sin, servitude to sin, supplication, and then salvation.
You know what? I was not thinking about that, but I think you're absolutely right, Randy, that in our New Testament experience, a lot of people get into sin, and they find themselves enslaved to sin until they cry out to God, and He brings salvation. And so He becomes the fourth stage of this, which is our actually our salvation, not only eternally, but a salvation from a lifestyle that comes in. And so that's. Does anybody know who the enemies were?
Moabites,
Could you name some of them?
Edomites,
Moabites.
Hittites,
Hittites, stalactites. Let me give you a list of them. Canaanites is a general term. Perizzites, which is not parasites, but Perizzites. Philistines, Jebusites, Ammonites, and Amorites. Those are two different groups. Ammon and Amorites. The Moabites, Sidonians, the Hivites, and the Hittites, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the Kedemites. And I don't remember where they figured in. I think they were with Joshua. So as I said, there were 7 cycles of them, and they went through that. Yeah.
Were the Moabites not considered an enemy because they deceived Israel into making a treaty or something? Because I didn't hear them on the list.
The
Did you?
Moabites.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
good,
I meant- I
because I think
mentioned
they
them.
deserve to be.
Yeah, they're on the list. They're right after the Midianites.
Okay. Yeah, and before the Mennonites.
No, they were after Amorites, Moabites. What did you say?
You know,
Okay.
it's just,
Well, one story with them, you mentioned Moabites, and one story with them was, you remember one deliverance from there? They had a King Eglon.
lefty lets fatty have it.
Yep. Yep. Lefty let fatty have it. So, who was the judge? What was the judge's name? Eglon. And I like the way the King James reads on that. The guy pulled out, he was left-handed, and so it wasn't expected he would be pulling a spear out with it using his left hand, pulled a dagger out, and shoved it into the king's belly. And I think the King James reads, and the flesh closed up instead thereof. Meaning, that thing went all the way in. And, yeah, quite a story. So that's the period of the judges. And the theme that runs through that period of time is there was no king in Israel, and everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. Just like today. The last of the judges was Samuel, and he is the one who appoints the first king. And so the next time period is 120 years, called the United Kingdom, and it's from 1051, when Saul is crowned, until 931, when Solomon dies. Period of 120 years. 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And they're written on your chart. I wrote their names and the years for them on your chart. So if you find the United Kingdom area and just drop down, you'll see the names of those guys. Okay? By the way, this is a good time to point out something, that if you were going to read about the kingship of Saul, you would go to what book? And just follow your chart and see what book you would be in. You have to look at your chart. First Saul. Okay, 1 Samuel will give you the story of the kingship of Saul. Now you notice the book of Psalms has an arrow pointing to 1 Samuel, and an arrow pointing is supposed to be to 1 Chronicles and 2 Samuel. David wrote about half the Psalms, and I'm sure he wrote several of them, such as Psalm 18, during the kingship of King Saul. So you've got that. Now, the kingship of David, if you wanted to, what scripture would you go to read the kingship of David? 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. So 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles tell the same story. Kingship of David.
David was anointed king while Saul was still.
Yes, in 1 Samuel.
So does that time account? Is that accounted for?
Well, we're not counting his kingship until he's actually anointed or actually crowned king after the death of Saul. And David does not come to rule over all of Israel right away, only Judah, because the rest of the tribes really wanted a descendant of Saul to be the second king and make that dynasty live on. But finally, David rules over all of the tribes. Then, if you're going to read about the third king, King Solomon, you'd read in what book? First Kings, or Second Chronicles, first 9 chapters. And First Kings would be the first 11 chapters. And then that will bring the United Kingdom era to a close in 931, when God judges Solomon and says, because you have not obeyed me and you've gone after these other gods, I'm going to tear the kingdom from your descendants. But for the sake of David and the city of Jerusalem, I will give you, he says, one tribe. It winds up being Benjamin also, which was a very small tribe. And so the south had Judah and Benjamin, and the north had the other 10 tribes. And you will read about that in First Kings chapter 12. You'll starts that, and First Chronicles chapter 10. You would read about about that happening. The rest of First Kings and all of Second Kings and a good deal of Second Chronicles is going to be, well, all of Second Chronicles will be talking about the subsequent kings of both Judah and Israel, because now they have separate kings, of course, and so it'll go back and forth and talk about sometimes the king of Judah or the king of Israel, and that goes back and forth. But so from the 10th chapter of Second Chronicles and the 12th chapter of First Kings, you read about all those kings after the split. That was we talked about the United Kingdom. Then the United Kingdom, we just said that. Then the divided kingdom was 931 to 722, which was a period of 209 years. And what happened in 722? Look at your chart. What happens in 722?
Assyrian captivity.
Yes, so you'll notice that the word Israel is there, and you see Israel's block comes to an end in 722 with the words Assyrian captivity, 722 BC. And that's when the Assyrians came under Shalmaneser the fifth, and what'd you say?
I said that's easy for you to say.
Came down, besieged the capital of Israel. What was the capital of Israel at that time? Samaria, the town of Samaria, and they besieged it for 3 years, and then overthrew it. There was famine, a lot of famine, cannibalism, even that happened in that time. And then, so Israel was overthrown, and that was the end of their kingships, of the kings of Israel. The south lasted longer. So you have the period known as the single kingdom, and that single kingdom is simply Judah. And that's from 722 until 586, a period of 136 years. And the single kingdom, Judah and Israel both had approximately 20 kings. Some people say Israel had 19, but it depends on how you do your counting there. But Judah had 20 kings. 8 of them were good kings and tried their best to rid Judah of idolatry and to make Judah faithful to the Lord. Does anybody know the name of the last really good king of Judah?
Josiah.
Josiah. And I tell you, in my opinion, he outshines most of the good kings. He had such potential and would have led Judah and would have led Israel, because he reached out to Israel as well and would have led them all back to faithfulness to God had he not made a bad military decision. We won't go into that tonight. Anyway, the single kingdom lasts until 586, and actually what we want to say, and you can read about their demise in 2 Kings 25. The Babylonian captivity was 70 years long. It had 3 deportations. That is, Nebuchadnezzar came 3 times to Jerusalem and carried away exiles. The first, you can figure 70 years from the first deportation in 606 to the first return in 536. And hence you can get the 70 years. Or you can figure 70 years from the destruction of the temple in 586 till its rededication in 516, 515, somewhere in that area. 3 deportations. Daniel and his friends were taken in the first deportation in 605. And then Ezekiel was taken in the second deportation along with King Jehoiachin in 597, and others were taken. And then the final deportation was 586. And if you were able-bodied and able to walk, you made the trip. So 3 deportations. So if you're reading Daniel or Ezekiel, you have to put in your mind where you are as you are, where was the author when he was writing that book? So that helps.
The best narrative in Scripture of the fall is found in Jeremiah.
Okay. What chapter?
Someone was yet, I don't remember.
Okay.
But there's actually, he describes the actual fall and what happens after.
Okay. I'll talk with you later about that.
Yeah,
Okay, then you have 3 returns, and that is, when the 70 years are up, there are 3 returns, 538, 458, and 444. The period of the returns includes from the first return until the end of the Old Testament, when Malachi writes. In about 430. So the returns are taking place there. the first return was under Zerubbabel in 538. And there were about 50,000, real close to 50,000 Jews that came back in that return. That was in 538. They were led by Zerubbabel. And then the second was under Ezra in 458, and you had 4,000 to 5,000 Jews that returned with Ezra. And the third return was under Nehemiah in 444 BC. But we do not know how many returned with Nehemiah. Okay. Now, I'd like for you to take your chart and I'd like you to look at the part that has 1 Samuel and, okay, let's see. Okay, right here. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and all of that. What time is it going to be? Okay, well, we'll have a couple minutes. Now, I want you to notice two non-writing prophets that were writing both to Israel, ministering both to the northern kingdom of Israel. They didn't write any books, but they're very colorful and very important. And they were Elijah and Elisha. I don't think I had the right slide here. Let me see if I've got
Yeah,
that.
they're on there. They're on there. Yeah.
Oh, they're down
It's
there.
there.
Okay. Okay. Let me see if this one's any better. Well, now they're up at the top. So on your chart, you can see that Elijah, 1 Kings, he comes on the scene in chapter 17. We don't know anything about Elijah until chapter 17 of 1 Kings, and he just comes on the scene, goes up to the king and says, "Not going to rain, as God's judgment, it's not going to rain until my word." And then God said, "Now you go and hide." And so he told him where to hide. And so that was Elijah. And he is his ministry basically is the rest of 1 Kings. And he dies, and Elisha takes over in chapter 2 of 2 Kings. So if you want to read about Elijah, you're going to read about him in 1 Kings. If you want to read about Elisha, you got to look at 2 Kings, and you'll read about Elisha until about chapter 17, I think. Also wanted to point out the prophets to you. You have 3 prophets, writing prophets to the north. You see those? They're in kind of purple boxes. And they are right here, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. They are 3 pre-exilic prophets to the north, and they are prophesying to the north. They're also prophesying to the south, at least some of them. But primarily their ministry is to the north. And so the way I remember those is Jah, J-A-H, would be pronounced Jah. So when I think of Jonah, I think of Jaws. Anyway, J-A-H. So if you try to use J-A-W, it's not going to work. There has to be J-A-H. But what's that? Hosea. Oh, Wosea. Okay, Hosea. Yeah, I guess that would work. All right. We try anything to get it to so we can remember things. I want you to look at the prophets, These are the prophets to the south. And notice we've got pre-exilic prophets, exilic prophets, and post-exilic prophets. What do we mean by exilic? The exile. And we're talking about, in the south, the Babylonian exile that was 70 years long. And so there were some prophets that ministered, and basically their message is, God is going to judge you, because that's what he said in Deuteronomy 28. And he's going to exile you if you don't straighten up. And so you've got these prophets with that kind of a message. So Obadiah, we don't know when Obadiah wrote, but some people put him here, some people put him all over the map, actually. But I'm going with 844 BC. And then Micah, 750 to 686. He's contemporary with Isaiah. So they probably knew each other. And Isaiah 739 to 681. And then Nahum in 633. Jeremiah ministered from 627 to 586. In 586, you remember, was the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jeremiah's book is about that time. And Zephaniah 619. Habakkuk 605. Who was taken in 605? Daniel and friends, the year that Habakkuk ministered. And then Joel in 597. Who was taken in 597? Ezekiel. Yeah. And King Jehoiachin also. So I came up with an acrostic for some of this, and it wasn't very good. But if you guys come up with a way to memorize those, that would put you at the front of the class. Those are the pre-exilic prophets. The exilic prophets, that is those during the time of the exile, would be Jeremiah's book, Lamentations, which is a lament over the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of God's people. And I put the date on there, 585. Probably it's 586 to 585 when he's writing that book. Also Ezekiel, who was taken in 597. I think his first prophecy, though, is in 593. That's Ezekiel. And then Daniel was taken in 606, and he spans the whole 70 years in his life. He does not return, but those three, and the way I remember that, it's Daniel, Ezekiel, and Lamentations, and the way I remember that is D-E-L is at the Babylonian captivity, you were either dead, exiled, or left because you couldn't go anywhere. That's the way I did it.
It'd be crazy.
It's hard to remember those.
It'd be easier.
You could probably remember the books easier than my little things. I want you to look at your chart, and you'll see Ezra. It's not, I don't know if I can.
There it is.
Okay. Ezra does not figure in the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra. The first 6 chapters have to do with the building of the first exiles returning under Zerubbabel and trying to build the temple. They are encouraged by Haggai and Zechariah in 520 and 520 to 515. And finally, the temple is dedicated in 515. So their ministry was there. Also in that gap between 6 and 7 is, by the way, is about an 80-year gap there, I think. 538 to 458 is how many years? On 80? Something like that. Anyway, Ezra comes on the scene in chapter 7 and is dealing more with social, religious reform. And then you have the book of Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the walls.
My
And there,
my life verse is in Ezra.
is it? What is it?
Ezra 7:10, for Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel.
We got to quit. I just looked at the clock. All right. Okay. Would you lead us in prayer?
Sure. Father, we just come for you tonight. Just thank you for this opportunity to gather. Thank you for this opportunity to get to know your word better, get to know the history of it, be able to figure our way through it, and just help us to continue to always be students of your word and wanting to know it, to study it, to memorize it, to apply it to our lives. And thank you for Jerry giving us time to put all these materials together and to teach us each Sunday night. And I pray you would just continue to bless us all with more and more knowledge, not just head knowledge, but heart knowledge, and everything from your word. And just give us a safe week this week. And we'll just give you all the praise and honor and glory in Jesus' name.
And thank you for the food.